June 27, 1976. An Air France plane took off from Tel Aviv bound for Paris with a scheduled stopover in Athens. After boarding new passengers in Greece, the Airbus A300 once again lifted into the air. At 12:30, a flight attendant entered the cabin carrying a tray of water. Suddenly, her face twisted in fear. The glasses on the tray rattled. In front of her stood a woman holding a pistol, the barrel aimed directly at her stomach. That woman was 29-year-old Brigitte Kuhlmann, a German. At that moment, the plane, with 248 passengers and 12 crew members on board, was hijacked by pro-Palestinian terrorists. The Israel Defense Forces now faced an almost impossible mission to rescue all the hostages. The operation would go down in history as Operation Entebbe, also known as Operation Yonatan, because it was led by Israeli military officer Yonatan Netanyahu. That day, the Air France Airbus A300 had barely left the runway in Athens when the nightmare began. Among the passengers were 4 people who were not travelers at all, but members of 2 radical groups united by a single purpose. 2 belonged to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a Marxist-Leninist organization that had pioneered the tactic of hijacking aircraft. The other 2 were Germans, Wilfried Bose and Brigitte Kuhlmann, leaders of the Revolutionary Cells, a violent splinter of the leftist Red Army faction. Kuhlmann was the only woman among them, but she proved to be the most ruthless. To the outside world, her past seemed paradoxical. She had once run a small school for children with developmental disabilities in Hamburg and even published poetry. Yet within a few years, she had transformed from an educator into a militant revolutionary, convinced that violence was the only language imperialism would understand. Together with her lover Bose, she went underground, plotting attacks against what they saw as capitalist oppression. Their alliance with Palestinian militants gave them the opportunity to strike on a far larger stage, an international passenger plane filled with civilians. The takeover began abruptly. Brigitte stood in the aisle, a grenade clenched in her hand. With chilling calm, she yanked out the pin and declared that if anyone moved, she would release her grip and kill everyone on board. The threat was terrifyingly real. 2 young Arabs sprinted down the aisle with pistols, backing her up, while Bose forced his way into the cockpit to control the pilots. The passengers were ordered to raise their hands. One by one, they were pulled from their seats, searched, and lined up against the cabin wall. Passports, photographs, and papers were seized and stuffed into sacks. The cabin that had moments before been filled with the chatter of holiday travelers was now silent, save for the shouted commands of the hijackers and the muffled sobs of frightened hostages. The demands soon followed. The plane was to be diverted to Benghazi, Libya, the domain of Muammar Gaddafi, a man infamous for his eccentric and unpredictable rule. The hijackers made their cause clear. They were fighting Israel, and their price for the passengers' lives was the release of Palestinian prisoners. If their demands were not met, they warned, they would begin executing hostages one by one. For hours, the plane circled above Benghazi awaiting clearance to land. Finally, it touched down and was immediately surrounded by Libyan soldiers and police vehicles. The passengers remained trapped inside the aircraft for nearly 7 tense hours while negotiations unfolded between the hijackers and Gaddafi's government. For those inside, every passing minute was filled with dread. Being stranded in the custody of Gaddafi, a man known for sudden and violent decisions, was itself a terrifying ordeal. During this stopover, one heavily pregnant passenger went into labor. She was the only person released, taken to a Libyan hospital as her contractions intensified. For everyone else, the message was clear. No one would leave unless the hijackers' conditions were met. After refueling, the aircraft lifted off again. Its new destination was even more ominous: Uganda, ruled by the infamous Idi Amin. Amin had once courted Israel, even training with the Israeli military during his early years. However, by the mid-1970s, he had severed ties, instead turning to Arab regimes and the Soviet Union for support. In return, they showered him with money, weapons, and prestige. By then, he was feared as the Butcher of Africa, a dictator whose cruelty had become legendary. Enemies of the regime were executed in the thousands. Some were dismembered, their bodies grotesquely served at Amin's own table. Ministers and officials were forced to share in these cannibalistic lessons, reminders of the absolute power of their leader. For Amin, hosting the hijackers was not a burden, but a political opportunity. By welcoming the pro-Palestinian terrorists into Entebbe, he could cement his role as a champion of the Arab cause while flaunting his defiance of Israel in the West. And so, under the dictator's protection, the Air France Airbus finally landed at Entebbe Airport. The passengers, now exhausted and terrified, were herded off the plane. It was here, in the sweltering Ugandan night, that the stage was set for one of the most daring rescue missions the world would ever witness. When the Air France plane touched down in Entebbe, the hijackers were no longer just the four who had seized it in midair. They were soon reinforced by 4 more armed militants, an entire squad of 8, working in shifts, watching every corner, every movement, every breath of their captives. Their demand was precise: the release of 53 Palestinians. 40 sat in Israeli jails. 13 more were imprisoned in Kenya, France, Switzerland, and West Germany. If by July 1st, 1976, the demand was not met, they vowed hostages would begin to die. Close to midnight, the atmosphere inside the hall shifted dramatically. The doors swung open, and in strode Idi Amin. He was a vision of vanity and menace, full military regalia, chest weighed down by rows of medals, his swagger amplified by a retinue of Ugandan soldiers and Palestinian gunmen. The sudden arrival of the dictator stunned the hostages into silence. For a moment, many believed the nightmare might end, that perhaps Amin had come to negotiate their release. Instead, Amin performed his own cruel theater. Smiling broadly, speaking in a soft, almost paternal tone, he told the captives he was their friend. They were, he claimed, under his personal protection. If they cooperated, if they wrote letters to the Israeli government pleading for the release of the freedom fighters, they would all go home soon. He promised food, mattresses, and humane treatment. And, as if to confirm his words, supplies did arrive once he departed. But the gesture felt hollow. Everyone understood the real power lay with the hijackers, not with Amin's feigned benevolence. The conditions were stifling. The hall where the hostages were confined was hot, overcrowded, and airless. People huddled on the floor, whispering to one another, clinging to fragments of hope. When Ugandan soldiers knocked through a wall into an adjacent room the following day, the hostages initially rejoiced. More space meant more air, perhaps even a trace of dignity. Yet this sense of relief evaporated almost instantly. The Germans and Palestinians carried in a table, set up 2 boxes, and began to call names. Passports were collected, examined, and tossed into piles. Those summoned were led away into the next room. At first, the process seemed arbitrary. Then realization set in with a chill more cutting than the equatorial heat. Only Israelis and Jews were being sent away. It was selection, the echo of history's darkest chapter. Survivors of the Holocaust recognized it instantly. One elderly man, a survivor of Auschwitz, rolled up his sleeve and silently showed Wilfried Bosse the blue tattoo inked into his flesh decades earlier. Bosse looked him in the eye and insisted, "I am not a Nazi, only an idealist." But for those watching, the moment was unbearable. The past was no longer past. It had returned in a new, grotesque form. Of the 248 passengers originally aboard, 84 were Israeli citizens. The terrorists announced that all non-Jewish passengers and the crew would be released and flown out on another Air France plane dispatched to Entebbe. But Captain Michel Bakos refused. Standing before the hijackers, he declared that his duty extended to every soul who had boarded his aircraft. He would not abandon them. His crew echoed his words, and even a French nun resisted being forced out, insisting another hostage should go in her place. Eventually, Ugandan soldiers dragged her onto the waiting plane. In the end, 85 Jewish hostages, Israelis and non-Israelis alike, remained, along with 20 others, mostly the loyal Air France crew. They were trapped in the old terminal, watched day and night by men with rifles. When news of the hostage crisis reached Israel, leaders immediately clutched their heads. Within minutes, it was clear. There would be no negotiating with the African butcher, Idi Amin. There was only one option, a military strike. For appearances, Israel pretended to enter negotiations. It worked. The terrorists agreed to extend their deadline by 3 days. A small victory, but those 3 days gave the army the time it needed to reach Uganda and prepare the assault. On July 3, 1976, The Israeli cabinet approved the plan. Major General Yekutiel Adam was appointed commander, with Matan Vilnai as his deputy, and Brigadier General Dan Shomron was placed in charge of the ground operation. Planning had to be done under crushing time pressure. Shimon Peres later recalled how Air Force Commander Binyamin Peled asked him, "Are we planning to capture only Entebbe or all of Uganda?" "What's the difference?" Peres replied. "Entebbe will take 100 fighters. All of Uganda will take 500. Peres answered with a half-smile. "Then we'll limit ourselves to Entebbe." Intelligence worked around the clock. It turned out the Entebbe airport had been built by an Israeli firm, and the original blueprints were still in the archives. A Mossad agent even managed to infiltrate Uganda and take fresh photographs of the terminal. Military intelligence estimated that around Entebbe there were 21,000 Ugandan soldiers, 267 armored vehicles, and approximately 50 MiG-17 and MiG-21 fighter jets. To prepare, the Israelis built a replica of the airport terminal and trained inside it. Mossad also gathered invaluable information from freed hostages. One French Jew with military training and a phenomenal memory described every detail: the number of terrorists, their weapons, and the positions of the guards. But one enormous problem remained: distance. The Hercules C-130SA could not fly to Entebbe and back without refueling. Only secret negotiations with Kenya secured Israel a lifeline: permission to land and refuel at Embakasi Airport in Nairobi. That decision was the key to success. Lieutenant Colonel Joshua Shani, the lead pilot of the raid, later admitted, "We planned the whole operation in 48 hours. Out of the entire concept, we could only work out 2%. The other 98% we left to improvisation." That night, 4 massive Hercules aircraft lifted off into the darkness. Israel was challenging time, distance, and Amin's entire army. One of the boldest operations in history was about to begin. Night. 4 Hercules planes flew at an extremely low altitude, only 30 meters above sea level. They had taken off from Israel, crossed the Red Sea while avoiding Egyptian, Sudanese, and Saudi radars, skirted Djibouti, passed through Somalia, and then navigated the East African Rift Valley to approach Lake Victoria. On board, about 100 Israeli commandos. Everyone knew the smallest mistake could cost hundreds of lives. Alongside the transports flew 2 Boeing 707s. First, a mobile field hospital had been set up. It landed in Nairobi at Embakasi Airport, where Kenya had secretly granted Israel refueling rights. On the second was the overall commander of the operation, General Yekutiel Adam. His plane circled above Uganda, maintaining communication and control. The ground force was divided into 3 rings. The inner ring was the assault unit of Sayeret Matkal, comprising 29 men under Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu, the brother of Israel's future Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Their mission was to storm the old terminal where the hostages were held. Majors Muki Betzer and Matan Vilnai led 2 strike groups. The second ring consisted of special forces from Golani and the paratroopers, whose task was to block Ugandan soldiers from reaching the terminal. The third ring was support: engineers, armored personnel carriers, and a detachment tasked with destroying the MiG-17 and MiG-21 fighters on the ground, preventing the Ugandan Air Force from taking off. At 11 p.m. local time, the Hercules transports touched down on the runway. The cargo doors opened even before the planes came to a complete stop. From one rolled out a convoy of Land Rovers. At the head, a black Mercedes, specially brought from Israel. It was identical to the car Idi Amin usually used. The plan was clear: to make the guards believe the dictator himself had arrived. The convoy sped toward the terminal, but 2 Ugandan sentries stood by the road. They knew Amin had recently replaced his black Mercedes with a white one and ordered the convoy to halt. The silence was shattered by the muffled cracks of silenced pistols. The guards fell. One Israeli commando noticed they were still breathing and finished them with a burst of rifle fire. A second's delay could cost the hostages' lives. The assault began earlier than planned. The commandos leapt from their vehicles and rushed toward the building. In their hands, rifles, grenades, and a loudspeaker. As they ran, the shout rang out, "Get down! We are Israeli soldiers." Panic erupted inside the hall where the hostages were held. Some dropped to the floor, others froze in terror. In the chaos, several hostages were tragically mistaken for terrorists. 19-year-old Jean-Jacques Memoni, 52-year-old Pasco Cohen, and 56-year-old Ida Borochevich, a Jewish emigre from Russia, were killed by friendly fire. According to eyewitnesses, at the moment the assault began, there was only one terrorist in the hall, the German Wilfried Bose. He raised his rifle, but at the last moment ordered the hostages to hide in the bathrooms and turned his fire on the Israelis. He was killed seconds later. The other 3 hijackers were in the adjoining room. The Israelis hurled grenades inside, stormed in, and killed them. The firefight in the terminal lasted no more than 2 minutes. When the smoke cleared, the hostages were free. At that moment, 2 more Hercules aircraft landed and unloaded armored vehicles. Some troops set up a defensive perimeter, while others blew up and set fire to 8 Ugandan fighter jets on the runway. But the battle was not over. As the freed hostages were being led to the planes, Ugandan soldiers opened fire from the control tower. The Israelis responded with automatic rifles and RPGs. In the short but fierce exchange, Yonatan Netanyahu was struck in the neck and died almost instantly. He was the only Israeli commando killed in Entebbe. Several others were wounded. 53 minutes after landing, it was over. All 7 hijackers were dead. Between 33 and 45 Ugandan soldiers had been killed. Of the 106 hostages, 3 were killed and about 10 were wounded. 1 woman remained in Uganda. She had been taken to a hospital before the raid. But 102 people were rescued. 1 hour after the raid began, the first plane carrying freed hostages lifted off for Nairobi to refuel. 42 minutes later, the last Hercules departed Ugandan soil. Israel had proven that the impossible was possible. The morning of July 4, 1976, shocked the world. For the first time, a small nation surrounded by enemies demonstrated its capability to fly thousands of kilometers, break through the defenses of an entire army, and bring its citizens home. Israel had achieved the impossible, and it changed the rules of the game. In Israel, the joy was boundless. People greeted the planes with flowers and tears. Newspapers wrote of a miracle, and the army became a legend. The name of the fallen commander, Yonatan Netanyahu, became a symbol of sacrifice and heroism. Western nations largely admired Israel's courage. U.S. President Gerald Ford and British Prime Minister James Callaghan affirmed Israel's right to defend its citizens. France, whose plane had been hijacked, expressed gratitude for the rescue of its people. Headlines hailed a brilliant operation and a new standard in the fight against terrorism. In Africa and the Arab world, the reaction was very different. Ugandan President Idi Amin was enraged. He delivered a speech accusing Israel of violating his country's sovereignty and of carrying out a barbaric raid. In retaliation, his soldiers brutally murdered Dora Bloch, an elderly Israeli woman with a British passport who had been taken to a hospital in Kampala before the operation. Her death became a grim symbol of the dictator's vindictive cruelty. The Organization of African Unity condemned Israel for aggression against Uganda. Many Arab states issued harsh statements, calling the operation piracy and an act of Zionist terror. Palestinian terrorist groups swore revenge. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine declared that Entebbe was not the end, but the beginning of a new wave of struggle. Leaders of Fatah and other factions used the raid for propaganda, promising new strikes against the Zionist enemy. Yet, no matter how much anger Entebbe provoked in the Arab world, the operation entered history as an example of determination and military genius. It proved that Israel was ready to challenge an entire continent if the lives of its citizens were at stake. And what do you think? Could any country today carry out an operation as daring and successful as Entebbe? Share your opinion in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Thank you for watching.